sort of assumed by most Americans that there's something peculiarly Southern and pro-slavery about secession. Not at all. In fact, some of the early secessionists were New Englanders who wanted to get out of a union with the slave states. So the word has acquired associations that are not part of its actual definition. And one of the most interesting facts about these early secession movements is that nobody seriously challenged the right of a state to secede. That is, they still took for granted that a state was sovereign by definition, not because sovereignty was added on to the definition of a state. It was part of the definition itself. It was not something super added or extraneous or something a state would make a controversial claim to. If it wasn't sovereign, if it wasn't independent and free of other states, it wasn't really a state. So it was understood that the Confederation, the United States, and it was often called a confederacy, was composed of sovereign states in voluntary union, each of which had the right to secede. And nobody questioned state sovereignty and the right of secession because it would have been absurd to. Not until Andrew Jackson had the definition of state eroded enough that Jackson, who was in many ways a strong states' rights man, could actually threaten to invade any state that tried to secede. And that very threat, in fact, shocked people, including the very pro-union and secession-denying Daniel Webster. Well, sectional tensions kept increasing, and American understanding of the Constitution kept eroding until both culminated in the Civil War. The real issue at stake in our Civil War, or war between the states, as it's more properly called, was really whether the states were actually states, or were they merely subordinate parts of what Lincoln called a new nation. That was the Lincoln Doctrine, you might say, the doctrine that the Union was, as he put it, much older than the states. It was older than the Constitution, which raises a curious question. How can the union of the states be older than the states themselves? It's a bit like saying that a marriage is older than the spouses. The things united have to be at least as old as their union, you would think. But Lincoln claimed not only that the Union was older than the states and older than the Constitution, he also claimed that it was somehow superior to the Constitution. For Lincoln, no state could ever secede for any reason under the Constitution. No matter how tyrannical the federal government might become, no matter how many powers it might unjustly usurp, the states were stuck in it. They didn't exist apart from the Union. Now, the curious thing is that Lincoln's defenders basically admit, in many cases, the very thing Lincoln denied. For example, Gary Wills has written that the Gettysburg Address was the words that changed America. James McPherson, the historian, argues that Lincoln achieved a second American Revolution. George Fletcher of Columbia Law School has written a book saying that Lincoln gave us a whole new Constitution. Very impressive, these claims, but these men must not listen to themselves very closely, because what they're actually saying is that Lincoln was fighting against the old Constitution and that Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy were fighting for it. That's exactly what the argument was about. Lincoln would not thank them for this defense. If he was waging a second American Revolution, he was fighting against the first American Revolution and its principles. And if he was giving us a second Constitution, he was fighting against the first Constitution, the one he was sworn to uphold. He didn't take a vow to uphold a new Constitution. He took a vow to uphold the old one. But he always confused saving the Union with upholding the Constitution. They're two different things. The Constitution does not prevent a president, does not authorize a president or require him to save the Union in the sense of preventing secession. The Constitution says nothing about secession. And that was Lincoln's predecessor's position. James Buchanan said that the Constitution did not authorize secession, but it also did not give him any power to prevent it. So he could do nothing about it and had to let the states leave. Well, he was almost correct. The very fact that the Constitution speaks of the states as states and speaks of the United States in the plural means that it understood perfectly well that the states were still sovereign. As Jefferson Davis later argued, they couldn't have given up their sovereignty without even mentioning the fact that they were doing so. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says they were doing so. The Lincoln arguments that the Constitution forbade secession are all quite specious. And this will be the subject of my book on the subject. Of my book on Lincoln and the Constitution. I'm calling it King Lincoln, a phrase used by Congressman Clement Vallandigham, great American, whom Lincoln had exiled from the United States. As a matter of fact, Lincoln did all sorts of things unconstitutionally in order to, as he put it, save the Union. In other words, in order to force states to remain in the Union against their wishes, in order to deny their sovereignty, Lincoln was forced to violate actual clauses of the Constitution. One of his defenders, Harry Jaffa, says that Lincoln discovered a reservoir of presidential power in the Constitution that nobody else had ever discovered. Well, that's interesting. And by the way, well, it's one of my chief contentions that the expansion of the federal government has proceeded mostly through the device of claiming to find implied powers, something Jefferson was always skeptical of. Lincoln claimed to be Jefferson's disciple. He said that he had never had a political sentiment. I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. All honor to Jefferson, he said, to the man who in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people have the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. In other words, as Lincoln also put it, the Declaration had created a new nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, this is a gross misstatement of what was actually going on. These 13 colonies in 1776 did appeal to the principle that all men are created equal, of course. But it did not dedicate the 13 states to that proposition, much less did it say that they were now a new nation dedicated to the proposition. They are states, free and independent states, not a new nation, not a monolith from which none could ever secede. This was Lincoln's great bluff. It's worked pretty well because it's fooled most Americans ever since. This has become the official doctrine of the U.S. government. Now, oddly enough, there was really only one thing Lincoln and Jefferson really agreed about. and that was that the slaves should be freed and then removed from the country. They both belonged to the American Colonization Society, which held that slavery was wrong, that it should be ended by gradual and compensated emancipation. That is, that the slave owners should be compensated for their loss when their slaves were freed, and that these former slaves should be returned to Africa or at least sent outside the United States. Most people don't know to this day that Lincoln actually pushed this so ardently that in 1862, in his State of the Union message, he asked Congress to amend the Constitution to permit a colonization program funded by the federal government. Jefferson had likewise said that if the slaves were not freed and sent back to Africa very soon, it would be too late and America would be stuck with a permanent racial problem. Anyway, that was about the only thing Jefferson and Lincoln really seemed to have agreed on. Lincoln had a very limited education, as you know. He made himself literate, and he had a rhetorical genius of his own and an eloquence rarely matched by an American president. But Jefferson had an extremely cultivated mind, knew Latin, Greek, French, and English, and their literatures, and was interested, had a huge range of interests, and was a much profounder political thinker than Lincoln. And he did not intend the Declaration to be construed in the narrow way that Lincoln construed it. There was much more to it than all men are created equal. And Lincoln ignored the part about free and independent states. Here was the greatest, most eloquent secessionist document of all time, the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln somehow construed it as forbidding secession. Jefferson would have been astounded to find his own declaration invoked to support tyranny and to deny the freedom and independence of the states. Amazing. It's all on the surface. You don't have to go deep to find this out. Lincoln's reading of the Declaration is patently opposite to what was meant by it. In order to save the Union, as he put it, Lincoln took extraordinary measures on grounds that they were necessary. They weren't necessary. They were necessary to preserve the Union, albeit not the same Union that was formed in 1776 and in the Constitution. It was a nominal union at gunpoint, a shotgun marriage, you might say, of the states, which in fact deprived them of their statehood by depriving them of their sovereignty. Now, ever since Lincoln and as a result of his war, no state can secede, as I say, for any reason whatsoever. Lincoln saw to this by occupying the states, conquering and occupying the seceding states, and all kinds of other ways too. He raised and funded an army on his own initiative without consulting Congress, unconstitutional. He suspended habeas corpus on his own motion. That was unconstitutional. He prevented elections in many of the states. He established puppet governments in even some of the Union states. He grossly violated the freedom of speech in every Union state. Apart from what he did to the South, he ran a reign of terror in the North. In the states he said were already free. And he said his cause was self-government while doing all this. After the war, after his victory and near the end of the war, he established puppet military governments in the conquered states, and he told his secretary, John Hay, that it was necessary to see that the vote in the conquered South was restricted to the, what he called the loyal minority, to see that they weren't outvoted. Now, as I understand it, in a democracy, the minority gets outvoted. Lincoln wanted a democracy in which the minority couldn't be outvoted, not the loyal minority, the chosen minority. It was just flagrant what he did. And I grew up revering Lincoln. I was taught all the usual things about what a great president he was, how the Civil War was fought for freedom, battle cry of freedom, as McPherson calls it, and all that. Well, we have to again go back even to the Articles of Confederation. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. These are free and independent states. That was the idea. Lincoln changed all that and helped to, in fact, erase the memory of free states, free and independent states. That is his real legacy. He was our anti-Jeffersonian president. Far from being a disciple of Jefferson, his victory in the war was not only a victory over the South, but a victory over Jefferson and Jefferson's principles. The cunning of it was the pretense that, of course, he was serving Jefferson's principles, that he was only fulfilling Jefferson's ideals. It was flagrant, but that's what you really have to do. If you want to win a war, Lincoln understood that you need a propaganda victory to go with a military victory. And the propaganda victory consists in convincing people that you are fighting for the causes they believe in, that you are fighting for the Constitution even when you're fighting to overthrow the Constitution. We do have a new Constitution thanks to Lincoln. We did have a second American Revolution thanks to Lincoln. Lincoln's words did change America. His defenders are right. They only forget to tell us that Lincoln was wrong, that he was doing things that he was doing the very things he denied doing. One of the most interesting tiny facts, trivia you might say, about the Civil War was that the South had a general and Secretary of War for a while named George Wythe Randolph. Randolph was the grandson of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was, in our terms, a very ardent secessionist. On several occasions, he had to face the question of secession. He didn't like secession, but he thought it was a necessity. He thought it was, first of all, an inalienable right, and also a practical necessity. He wrote in 1816, after he had left the presidency, to William Crawford, "If any state in the Union will declare that it prefers separation to a continuance in Union, I have no hesitation in saying, let us separate." On another occasion, he confided to Crawford that he wished some of the northern states who favored unlimited commerce and war would withdraw from the Union. Lincoln, or Jefferson I should say, always counseled caution and deliberation before taking the great step of secession, but he certainly held that secession was legitimate. Toward the end of his life, he wrote to William Branch Giles that we should, quote, separate from our companions only when the sole alternatives left are the dissolution of our Union or submission to a government without limitation of powers. But between these evils, he said, when we must make a choice, there can be no hesitation. In one of his last public papers, Jefferson, who always opposed the kind of internal improvements that Lincoln always favored, canals and railroads and such, said though he thought they were unconstitutional, that Virginia should submit to them rather than secede. He didn't deny the right of Virginia to secede at all. He merely said it was imprudent. This, by the way, is what Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens told the South before the Civil War. They saw that the South could never win a an all-out war with the North. And they said, therefore, yes, we have the right to secede, but it would be a mistake to exercise that right in these circumstances. We'll only get crushed because the North will insist on war and we will lose. They were exactly right. So, at the end of the Civil War, the Constitution was amended at gunpoint 3 times. The most amusing part, if you have a modern sense of humor, was the adoption of the 14th Amendment. It was made a condition of readmission to the Union. If the southern states wanted to get back into the Union, they had to adopt the 14th Amendment. The funny part, if you want to laugh, is that the North had insisted secession was illegal, and therefore the South had never left the Union. So how could it be denied readmission or readmitted if it had always been legally part of the Union? Well, such little details didn't trouble the Northern Republicans, who just decided that they were going to make the rules no matter at what cost in logic. But at least in those days, there was still enough residual respect for the Constitution that they thought they had to amend the Constitution in order to increase the powers of the federal government. And this is where things have taken a very bad turn since then. In the second decade of the 20th century, more amendments were added, and they all, the income tax was adopted, the prohibition was passed, women's suffrage was adopted, but the amendments always said Congress shall have power to enforce the provisions of this article by appropriate legislation. In other words, if Congress wanted a new power, it had to get a constitutional amendment. And those amendments regularly said Congress shall have power. They no longer bother with all that. If the president wants a war on drugs, he doesn't get an amendment to the Constitution authorizing the banning of certain drugs. He just goes ahead and proclaims it. And nobody thinks twice about it. This is how the American constitutional ethos has declined. The other day in the sodomy decision, I think it was in the diversity decision. The U.S. Supreme Court, in the majority opinion written by Sandra Day O'Connor, said that if we would need diversity in higher education in order to realize the dream of one nation indivisible. It may not have occurred to Mrs. O'Connor, but one nation indivisible is not a phrase that occurs in the Constitution. It's from the Pledge of Allegiance. The court doesn't even know the text of the Constitution anymore. That's how bad things have gotten. Not that they care. The floodgates were really open under the Franklin Roosevelt administration, when the court began to uphold all sorts of legislation unauthorized in the Constitution, and ruled that the 10th Amendment should not restrain Congress in any way. It was a mere truism. So the Constitution under Franklin Roosevelt finally ceased to have any real inhibiting effect. The device under which all this happens is the concept of implied powers. The idea that powers don't have to be specified in the Constitution in order for the federal government to claim them. The idea is the federal government is permitted to do anything it's not absolutely forbidden to do. If the Constitution is silent on whether the government can put a man on the moon or regulate paper diapers, it can go ahead and do it because nobody says it can't. This is the diametrical opposite of the philosophy of the framers and of Thomas Jefferson. Implied powers is invoked in the name, well, in pursuance of the necessary and proper clause, as many people feared it would from the first, or the powers of the Supreme Court are justified in the name of judicial review or of penumbras and emanations from passages that do make rights and powers explicit in the Constitution, under the Commerce Clause and under the aforementioned reservoir of presidential powers. Liberal praise of the genius of the Constitution as a living document is always praise of the stretchability of the Constitution. They're not really praising what the Constitution says. They're praising what others have been able to make it mean through ingenious interpretation. Exactly what Jefferson meant when he said that we must not make the Constitution a blank paper by construction. It has become a blank paper. It doesn't really mean anything anymore. Hasn't for a long time. When the court ruled that the sodomy and abortion laws of all 50 states are invalid, it was really saying that no state has ever properly understood the Constitution. That only the Supreme Court somehow can speak with authority on the meaning of the Constitution. By stripping away the right of secession, by crushing it, the federal government under Lincoln destroyed the final defense of the state's freedom and independence, and therefore of our freedom and independence. We are all mere subjects of the federal government, of a consolidated, usurping government. It's significant that these words have entirely fallen out of use in everyday political discussion in America. Today, in fact, presidents are rated great or not so great in proportion as they manage to expand the powers of the presidency and the federal government. So, naturally, Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt are regularly rated the two greatest presidents in polls of historians, that is, establishment historians. Maybe the greatest irony of the whole situation is that Thomas Jefferson is rated a great president for the Louisiana Purchase. Oddly enough, Jefferson had qualms about that purchase because nothing in the Constitution specifically authorized it. After feebly trying to get the Constitution amended to authorize it, he gave up, shrugged, and simply couldn't resist the deal from Napoleon Bonaparte. He bought much of North America for about the cost of a city block in a rundown city nowadays. So, in other words, thanks to Lincoln's new political morality, Thomas Jefferson himself is best remembered for his most signal violation of the Constitution. That's where we're left. The Constitution, basically, the living document, as they call it, is a dead letter. Or, as I like to put it, the U.S. Constitution poses no serious threat to our form of government. Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Well done.
Thank you. This is so deafening.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was certainly an eye-opening talk by Joseph Sobran. I've learned a great deal about the American Constitution.
Oh.
In England, we have the advantage of having no constitution, so the prime ministers can do just as they see fit. And we haven't done too badly until, I suppose, the last prime minister but one, and the last prime minister. The 10th Amendment, well worth remembering. It's an unusually eloquent amendment. One I was totally, I've heard of the first, I've heard of the second and the rest, but the 10th Amendment